If you're preparing for your A-levels, here are 4 incredibly powerful techniques that are not only going to help accelerate the way you learn them, but massively increase your recall when you want to remember them come exam time. Now, the first one is something called the Feynman technique, named after a famous Nobel Prize winning physicist called Richard Feynman, who described this technique of basically when you take a complex subject, you need to be able to boil it down to simple language that you could explain to a 10-year-old. Because he explains it with this, that if you cannot explain it in that sense, or when you try to explain it and you realize that you don't fully understand it the way you thought you did, this is where people often confuse familiarity with understanding. The same way that a lot of people, they know electricity, and if you say, oh, do you understand how electricity works? They go, well, yeah, I turn the switch on and the light comes on. But actually, if you ask them to explain exactly the ins and outs of the physics behind it, not very many people can actually explain how electricity works. And when you do the Feynman technique and you try to explain things to people, it helps identify the gaps where you think you understand it, but as soon as you go to verbalize it to somebody else, you actually realize that you don't quite know it as well as you can, and you having that familiarity issue. So it's a great way to do it. You don't necessarily have to find a child to explain it to them, but what you can do is pretend that you're saying it out loud or maybe in your head how you would explain it to somebody. And that helps identify the gaps, make sure that you really know it, and you can boil it down to its most simple, non-complex core elements, basically. Second thing is mnemonics. Now, you may already be well familiar with a mnemonic, something like Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow, but it's something that doctors use when they're learning all of the material that they need for medicine. It's basically when you have a list of things that you need to remember and you need to connect them all somehow with one word that marries them together. So you take, often what people do will be the first letter of every item that you need to remember, and then you combine it to make a word. So exactly like Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow makes Roy, and so on and so forth. But it's a really great way to condense material to a very small thing that you only need to remember that one word, and then you are much more efficient, and all of that information is so much easier to access when you need to come back to it at a later date. One of the most powerful techniques to recall things that you need to remember in a certain order is something called the Loki method or a memory palace. Now, you may have heard of this before, but what it basically does is takes a sequence that you know already. For example, it might be the journey from your home to a train station, and you can remember all of the things along the way, all the shops that you pass, the post box, it might be a school, a tennis court, whatever it is that you pass. You can remember those in order because you're so familiar with it. Now, when you need to remember something in a certain order, maybe it's historical dates in, let's say, the Second World War and what happens in what order, you can do that by attaching a marker or something to remind you of that thing along the way. So you could have something at the front door to remind you of a certain thing that happened at a certain date. When you get to the post box, you can remember that a certain person was involved in something and have them sat on the post box to remind you, and various things that you can get creative with along the way that are going to help you remember things in that order. You don't just have to remember it with journeys. You can do rooms in your house. Something like your front living room, you'll know very easily. And I'm sure if you just closed your eyes, you could tell me exactly where everything's laid out. So if you go in, say turn to the left, and you know where the coffee table is, where the TV is, where the sofa is. And you can do the same, attach things that will remind you of that thing along the way as you go around the room, and that will help you remember the order. These are things that take a little bit of effort up front and take work to basically embed those memories into your mind. But if you nurture them, if you remind yourself of them frequently, they're very easy to recall and will often stick with you for years. The final one, and a massively underestimated technique, is that of mind maps. We often think that we learn in a linear fashion, so we remember one thing after the other. But actually, often complex subjects are really mixed around and they're interwoven, and it's more like a connected web, because you'll have one big subject, and from that will stem several sub-subjects and sub-topics that you need to remember. And with that will be details as well. And often those details will be linked to not just one of the subtopics. They might be linked to a few things, and they might interrelate in lots of different ways. Again, this is a very powerful technique that doctors use when they're learning medicine, because lots of Blood markers or symptoms are often interrelated and correspond to similar diseases. So you might have a same blood marker raised in several diseases. So this is a great way to take a complex subject and understand not just from a broad view how it all works, but also to get into the weeds and understand how it's all related to other subjects. So when you have a really complicated subject with lots of different subtopics, it's a really good way to map it out and get it visualized in your brain as to how it works on a global scale, but also on a granular scale. If you'd like some more science-backed advice and really high-level techniques that are going to help you score the best in your A-levels, check out the rest of the channel where we can give you some really useful information to help you succeed.